Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are in this wide country. I want to welcome everyone from coast to coast to coast. I'm Andre Gracie, and I'm on the Reconciliation Week team. And it's a real honor to facilitate these sessions. I want to remind all the wonderful teachers and students out there, if you have questions today, to put them in the question and answer box, little chat box there, and we'll get to them at the end of the session. But now the important part, to introduce our knowledge keeper for today. I'm proud, I'm in Halifax, and Rebecca Thomas is with me today from Halifax. And she is a Mi'kmaq poet and activist, and amongst many other things, she has written children's books about growing up as the child of a residential school survivor. We are pleased to welcome you to this session, Old Enough to Go, Old Enough to Know, talking residential schools with kids. We are so pleased you've joined our session. And now over to you, Rebecca.
Gwe, thank you so much, Wulaliach, for providing me this opportunity to speak. I am excited. I am a little nervous, but I think it's because I want to do a good job. So I'm going to, I guess, begin a little bit about talking about myself. The presentation is going to have kind of three sections. The first is going to be talking about kind of the impacts on my family, being the daughter of a residential school survivor, and how that impacts, my identity. The next section is going to talk about why having representation in children's books are important and the impact that has on Indigenous kids. And then the third piece is going to be, when speaking about this and using these materials with non-Indigenous kids, what is their capacity for this, and what are some of the reactions and questions I've received and how I've handled them, in hopes that should the instructors and the teachers and the folks who are tuned in today are going to take on or are taking on this and aren't necessarily sure what kind of questions they can ask or answer, hopefully this will provide a little bit of guidance. So shall we get started? So Old Enough to Go, Old Enough to Know, talking residential schools with kids. I really wanted to talk or address the fact that kids have a great capacity for understanding and learning. And more often than not, when I get pushback about having conversations about residential schools with kids, with young people, I'm often told, well, they're too young to take on such a serious topic. And often my answer back to them is, if my father was old enough to go, your kids are old enough to know about it. And how do we have that conversation? So, shall we get started? So this is me. It says Nin. Nin means me in Mi'kmaq. This is me at 6 years old. It is my elementary school grade 1 class photo that was taken picture day. My great aunt made me this outfit at the request of my mom. My older sister teases me. She says I look like a young matador, but this was my class photo of me as a little kid. This is my father right now. So this photo was taken maybe about 5 years ago. We were at a greenhouse in Toronto. I can't remember the name of the greenhouse, but we decided to have a walk around. And this here is my father's class photo from his time spent in residential school. So my dad attended the Shubenacadie Residential School in Nova Scotia. It was the only official residential school that existed in the Atlantic region. And he went when he was 5 years old. So this photo captures my dad. I don't have the exact year specifically, but he was in residential school from the age of 5 to about 10 years old. And if you can see my mouse, this face here is the one that my dad has pointed out. And when we see the few photos we have of him as a young man, that we believe that to be him. So you saw my class photo when I was 6 years old, and this is my father's class photo of around when he was the same age here at the Shubenacadie Residential School. They have the school split between girls and boys. On the other side, on the left side, was where his sisters were attending, and he wasn't able to see them or hang out with them because they kept the boys and girls segregated quite strictly. So imagine going to a school with your sister and not being able to speak or see her for a long period of time. So you can tell that my experience in school was very different from that of my father's, and that has shaped my experience and identity in our family relationship for a very long time, to what it is today. And so with that, here is me I'm roughly 9 years old in this photo. And I wanted to point something out in this photo. So you can see me here. I am opening a Pocahontas pottery wheel. For me as a little kid, I never saw myself represented in any form of media. None of the Disney princesses looked like me. None of the storybooks that I read growing up looked like me. There was nothing that represented me or my family until Pocahontas came out. And now we know, I don't have to tell you, or I shouldn't have to tell you, that Disney's Pocahontas is a gross misrepresentation of what that story actually was. But for me as a young child, this was the very first time that I saw any form of representation of people who looked like my family members. Pocahontas looked like my older sisters. And so because of that, I gravitated towards it. It was the first time that I had representation that I felt that I was connected to. However, that representation was built on this mythical stereotype of what an Indigenous person should be. So even though I gravitated towards it because it looked like my family, it made me question a lot of who I was. And I said, well, I must not be that Native because I don't have friends that are animals. I've never had a tree give me advice. Leaves don't swirl around me when I have a profound thought, right? My understanding of what indigeneity meant was that of a Disney princess. And that was because there was no education or conversation about Indigenous people in Canada that was outside of the historical piece of there were Native people here and now there are white people. And that was about it. I didn't have much education beyond that, let alone an understanding that my father went to residential school. And that's why I don't have a good understanding of who I am in this moment. And so with that, talking about an identity timeline of how it affects me. And I've put this up there, and I know lots of other Indigenous folks can have similar experiences, but I'm going to walk you through this timeline briefly. So it started off with my dad is an Indian. And even though we have legal legislation like the Indian Act and Indian status, we know that the word Indian is no longer an appropriate use when referring to Indigenous people. But it's the word that my father at 78 years of age uses for himself. And so I don't correct him. But my understanding for a long time was, oh, well, my dad's Indigenous, but I'm not because my dad is. There wasn't a connection. He wasn't ever able to bestow that connection and understanding onto me. So even though he looked at me as his Mi'kmaq daughter, I didn't see myself as that because he didn't have the words or the capacity at the time to understand or to figure out how to explain that to me. And then eventually I kind of figured it out saying, well, if my dad's Mi'kmaq, my mom is white, then I must be half Native. And I went around for that for a while. But, as we know, when we are a part of these communities, that it's more about a lived experience. This notion of halfness, this blood quantum ideal is rooted in that of a Eurocentric understanding of indigeneity. And then from there, I went to being Micmac. So I didn't know what nation I was a part of. It wasn't language that was used, the concept of nation. My understanding at a young age was that being Native was just one monolithic race, and that's who you were. And it wasn't an understanding until later that, oh my goodness, there's so many of different kinds. We're so diverse. We all have our backgrounds and our histories and our stories. But that wasn't ever something that was communicated to me. And the word Micmac is a misnomer of our nation, Mi'kmaq, that is rooted in a word called Nigama, my community member or my family or, a trusted person. And then from there, I went to an Aboriginal self-identification piece. So when I was applying for university, my dad said, make sure you self-identify on your application. And I didn't understand what that meant. And then after I applied for university, I went and I got taken to a Service Canada office in Ottawa. And I was issued a status card and I was a band card Indian. So I became legislated into Canada as an Indigenous person. And up until this point, nothing of this has to do with culture, community, language, sense of belonging, ceremony, right? It all has everything to do with a misunderstanding of what indigeneity is, as well as a legislated piece of a document that has decided that I was Indian enough to be granted a band number. And then it was only when I reached university that I hear of the words Indian residential school, and that I learned about that. And it was in a very harsh moment when I was talking to my dad on the phone about residential schools, and he goes very casually, "Yeah, I went to one of those." And that shifted my perspective so entirely, from understanding and being understanding that I was something legal within Canada, to understanding that I was a part of a massive legacy within Canada. And my anger and frustration towards my dad for having struggled and not come to my birthdays or missed important things in my life because he was struggling, that anger shifted from him to a system that created this family legacy that I was living through. And then it was only from there that I started to move into the understanding of Indigenous, of being the first peoples of this land, that I'm part of a community that has an unbroken occupation of our territory for thousands of years, to being Mi'kmaq, to going to community events, to meeting my family, to being claimed back, to have people in my community say, yeah, we know Rebecca, she's one of us, she's great, to being Ilmu, which is our word for the people, that I am the people of the Mi'kmaq, Ilmu of the Mi'kmaq nation. And so this timeline, though the arrows pointed in one direction, can be fluid. It's a spectrum. And sometimes, understandably, when communities can guard themselves or maybe put up a couple of walls, it can bounce me back a few steps to, well, if I have a status card, so I know for sure that I'm Indigenous, but knowing that if I threw my status card into the Halifax Harbor, I would still be Mi'kmaq, right? And so understanding this both as teachers and as Indigenous people, that somebody can see something and expect a specific perspective or identity from an individual, but understanding that because of the legacy of residential school and where people are in those stages of cultural reclamation, that you have to check your expectations of what an Indigenous person is capable of, or what it is that they understand or know. And you also have to understand that you don't get first dibs to this story, that it is Indigenous people who get to figure it out first. And then from there, they can choose to let you in on their timelines. And so when I was learning about all of this process, my first experience of understanding the Shubenacadie residential school that my dad went to, going back to that conversation I had with him on the phone, was this book here. And it's called Out of the Depths by Isabel Knockwood. I think that this is required reading for anybody living within Mi'kma'ki, within Mi'kmaq territory of the Atlantic region, but it is definitely skewed towards an adult audience because it documents the experiences of Mi'kmaq children within the Shubenacadie residential school and the violence that occurred there. And so for me, having in a very whirlwind back-to-back piece, I went from hearing about residential schools, hearing that my dad went to residential schools, and then having a white professor assign me this book to read about the horrors that my father experienced in residential school. So to say that it was a traumatizing experience would be, I don't know how to explain it. It was awful. There were moments where I had to put this down and put the perspective of what my dad went through, and therefore how I grew up, really up close and personal in my face. And apart from, the time that my dad brought me to the site as a young teenager and said, this is where I went to school, but not understanding what residential schools were, this was my very first experience in understanding residential schools. And it was jarring. So I think to myself often that if there was conversation at a younger age, if this content was introduced when I was younger to my class, to my classmates, I would have been better prepared to address and understand what actually happened within residential schools. And so I wrote what I needed back then. And so this is the impact of residential schools. And now I want to talk about why representation is really important in that piece. So this is a book that I wrote. It's called Swift Fox All Along. You can see that I actually have a copy back here. And it is a story about Swift Fox, who's a young Mi'kmaq girl who's going to visit her family for the very first time on reserve. And in this book becomes all sorts of talking points with which teachers and people can talk about the impacts of residential schools and what are some of the lived experiences of Indigenous kids now. So The fact that Swift Fox's father doesn't live with her and her mom and her sister can be a really good piece. My dad growing up had addictions, and my mom didn't want that around us while we were growing up. So you can have a conversation about sometimes families, don't look like what you expect them to look like. And the impact of having representation in children's books and accessible to Indigenous children helps validate the experiences that they are having as a little kid. So for me, I didn't have a lot of validation. I had Pocahontas, but as we know, that wasn't an appropriate form of validation or a truthful form of validation of who I was as an Indigenous person. So when this book came out, I had tremendous support from friends and family, and it's done quite well. And as much honor as it is to get nominated for awards, it's when I receive messages like this that's on the left, and I'm going to read it because I know the print is small. That's the importance of this work here, and why it's important to teach this kind of material to younger kids, not only Indigenous, but also non-Indigenous. So this is from a friend of mine. His nephew lives with him in the summertime. They do the powwow trail together. And he sent me this picture of his nephew reading my book. And it says it's the first book he's ever read front to back, and no fuss about it either. He loved it. He says, "I really like your book. You did a really good job." And a few hours after the fact, he sent along another message that says, he's still talking about your book. He goes, "It feels like it's a book about my life, like when I moved to Membertou from Ontario." And so I know there are Indigenous kids who grew up like me, who grew up off reserve, who are trying to reconnect to their community and are feeling very scared and nervous. So in this story, Swift Fox, who is a mixed race Indigenous kid like me. So I have my freckles from my mom, but my dark hair and dark eyes from my dad. It talks about growing up in a family that can be fractured from residential school. Usually if her dad visits, they go to ice cream or the park. Most of the time her big sister comes too, but not today. And the nervousness that comes as being an Indigenous kid, being, introduced to culture or being put into situations that they haven't experienced before, and having that empathy and understanding for that. And so I wanted to show all the different kinds of Indigenous faces that exist as well. So throughout the book, you'll see all sorts of different kinds of Indigenous faces. You'll see Two-Spirit representation. You'll see Afro-Indigenous people. You'll see Indigenous people who don't necessarily always look like the Pocahontas stories, but rather real Indigenous people who have a varying of experience and looks and shapes. And that's also very important to see themselves represented in that way. And so you can see here, it says, her father says to her, "Today you're going to learn how to be Mi'kmaq." And what does that mean for a little kid? So for me, this is a saying that my dad has said to me, over and over and over again, like, "Oh, this is how Mi'kmaq people do it," or, "You're going to learn to be like an Indian today." And, though well-intentioned, it can certainly create this kind of internal struggle. Because for me, if I am Mi'kmaq, does that mean I'm failing right now? Does that mean I'm not doing a good job? Like, what does this mean to learn to be Mi'kmaq? I thought that's who I was. So having that understanding and perspective that culture is not something that's innately born into you, but rather learned and taught that you get from your community, also creates a space for empathy and understanding for not only Indigenous kids, but also non-Indigenous kids when it comes to their expectations of Indigenous people. And so it can soften and create more room for that kind of conversation between classmates as well as between adults as they age, because they've been introduced to this concept at a younger age. And so how does this impact, or how has this been received to non-Indigenous kids? So here is a book, it's called Fatty Legs. It's by Christy Jordan Fenton and Margaret Ulamon Pokiak. And so we got to take this piece and it got turned into a choral theater production, and we toured Southern Ontario. We did, I believe, 14 shows over 11 days, and we managed to reach a little over 10,000 students. And these students were between the ages of second, third grade, all the way up to late middle school, early high school. And we're able to talk about this stuff. And in this book, they talk about how the nuns abuse, Ulaman. They talk about how her braids were cut off, in a very traumatic way. And it addresses the despair of what it means to be a kid to come out of residential school, to go back to your community and feeling like you can't connect because you can't speak your language, or the food that you used to eat no longer feels familiar in your mouth, like all of these pieces. And after this session, we would have Q&As with the students who were in the audience, and they were able to ask us some really in-depth questions. And the capacity for kids to understand what is going on is so great. And I think we often underestimate their capacity. So these are some of the questions, I'm going to bring them up, that students have asked me. And these are the sorts of answers that I have given them. And I think it's just, I can't reiterate this enough. And I've said the words capacity so much, but kids have great capacity, and we underestimate them often. And so in the times that I've done this, these are the questions that I get asked, why were the nuns so mean, right? So what they recognized was a wrong that was being committed against somebody else, and they're able to understand and see that wasn't okay. So how do you answer that question, right? And in my experience, it's often been like that people thought being Indigenous was wrong. And so they wanted to stop people from being Indigenous in how they spoke and how they thought and how they acted. And so when they were trying to still be who they were, it made the nuns upset, and they wanted to punish the kids, right? So you're able to have those conversations because kids get that. You don't need to get into the nitty-gritty details of some of the horrors that happened, but you can talk about these kind of opposing ideas and why forcing somebody to think like you is wrong, right? You can have, I had questions of why did she have to cut his hair, like the nuns cutting my father's hair, or the nuns cutting Ulaman's hair. And again, that there's, for a very long time, people in power believed that there was one way to be and one way to look, and they would see people with long hair and they would say, that's not correct. Boys shouldn't have long hair. So they cut it. And then you can ask those questions back. Do you think boys can have long hair? Like, why do all those sorts of things? You can have these interactive conversations with kids. Questions like, why couldn't your dad see his family and talk his language? And again, with the knowledge that you've gained through reading things like Out of the Depths, you're able to have these conversations with kids and say things like, well, their families spoke Mi'kmaq, their families spoke their languages and practiced their culture. So they thought that if they were to go see their families, they wouldn't forget. So they kept their families separate. And then also talking about the process of doing this work. I've had kids, this one specifically came from a Mi'kmaq girl from my reserve who was in elementary school over Zoom, and she comes up to the camera and she whispers very shyly and she says, is it scary talking to white people about this stuff? And then she says, I'm really glad you wrote it. So that representation, again, really important, and talking about the emotions that come with this, right? It is scary. I mean, I don't know how many people are watching me right now, but I can feel how warm my face is. It's nerve-wracking, right, to put yourself out there, but understanding that sometimes it's scary to be brave, and to have these conversations so that kids can maybe be allies to the Indigenous kids in their class when they see something that isn't right happening. And then also understanding there's a process of reclamation. So kids have asked me, can I speak Mi'kmaq now? And I always tell them that I'm learning, but a lot of people don't speak Mi'kmaq who live around me. And so it can be really hard, but the people who do speak Mi'kmaq do so with a great pride. And I go to them for questions. And that just because I don't speak Mi'kmaq fluently doesn't make me any less a part of this community. So talking about that there isn't necessarily one way to be as an Indigenous person. And then also being aware that chances are you will have Indigenous students in your classes while you have these conversations, right? So I've had students come up to the mic and say, my Gidju went there. So Gidju is grandmother in Mi'kmaq. And so they'll just share that story. So being aware that you're also going to have kids and people in your classes with various experiences in their interactions with residential schools. So be mindful of that and mindful of validating their experiences too. And I want it to end very quickly. I see that we're, coming up to time, is that my father, though he went to residential school, and though, there are lots of times where we struggle to connect because, it doesn't matter how much we love each other, there was a divide that was put between us. And sometimes it can be really hard to be close, that he is immeasurably proud of me. And I love him very, very much. And so in these photos, on the left is us going out for brunch after it was announced that I was going to be poet laureate. And he was very proud of me. And on that day, he also showed me that he had got a 15 years sober chip from AA, which I was incredibly proud. So we celebrated together over eggs and bacon and toast. On the right is my father at my wedding. He married me and my husband. He smudged our rings. He, did ceremony together, as best he can remember, along with other elders. And then in the middle was a photo that was taken about 8 weeks ago. And that is my father holding my book, one of my books, I'm Finding My Talk, that I wrote about him and myself, and that I will finish off with reading to you. And I dedicated to this book to my father, who taught me as much as he could when he could. And so here we go. I'm finding my talk, the one I never had, the one that the schools took away from my dad. So if you can see in the book, it's illustrated by a Mi'kmaq artist, Pauline Young, who took photos of my family and did paintings and put them into this book. And I won't show you every photo, but I really wanted to show you a couple of the ones. So if you remember the picture of my dad in his ribbon shirt, so here he is in his ribbon shirt in the photograph with his eagle feather that he gave to me when I got married. So here we go. I'm finding my talk, the one I never had, the one that the schools took away from my dad. I'm finding my talk one word at a time. Gwe, Wolalin, Numultes. Sometimes they are very old and sometimes they rhyme. I'm finding my talk when I'm up on the stage, telling big stories or scribbling words on a page. I'm finding my talk, I'm meeting my family, I'm making new friends who choose to love me. I'm finding my talk with clumsy feet that pat down the grass with every drum beat. I'm finding my talk with every bead my regalia speaks through each stitch and seam. I'm finding my talk, it's in my smudge bowl when the smoke curls around me and makes me feel whole. I'm finding my talk, how it's written across the land, learning to take only what I need. Nedugalam makes me understand. I'm finding my talk through my community, from elders to kids. This world is still new to me. I'm finding my talk by speaking to my father, by loving him and being his daughter. I'm finding my talk by speaking with my sister, knowing we are different and I miss her. I'm finding my talk through my nephews and nieces, teaching them they are complete with all their different pieces. I'm finding my talk. It's on the inside. It's how I see the world through not one, but two eyes. I'm finding my talk, and it may take some time, but I'm learning to speak in a language that's mine. So there you go. I'm finding my talk. This kind of content, the content that you see by Christy Jordan Fenton, by so many other brilliant Indigenous artists and writers within the Indigenous lit world, will give you an abundance of resources to choose from as you're trying to have these conversations with young people. So, Walaliok, thank you so much. I think there might be some questions.
Yeah, there are, Rebecca.
Excellent.
Yeah. This is from a grade 5 student. At what age did you learn about your dad's experience?
I was in my 20s.
Wow. Okay.
When I learned about it. I hadn't heard the word residential school until after I was in university.
Another question was, how did it feel when your dad went back home after all the years of being away?
He had a really hard time to connect. He didn't go back home straight away after he left residential school. He went down to New York. He only went back to the community when he was in his 20s. And for him, it was really hard for him to stay connected. And so he didn't stay. So my dad's kind of been all around, and he lives in Toronto now. But for him, it was just really hard for him to go back to his community because he felt like he didn't fit in anymore.
Again, this is another difficult question. I think this, as you said, children have very intelligent questions.
Yes,
You need
of
to know.
course.
Did your dad's alcoholism start immediately after he returned from residential school?
No, because he was quite young when he left. He was, I think, 10 years old. But for him, he remembers, and he's told me the story about the first time he drank, and he was about 15 or 16 years old. And he said that he drank and it made him feel less pain. And so that was how he was able to, at that time, escape it. And it became something that he needed or depended upon to help him run away from how he was feeling, because facing how he was feeling was too difficult. And it was only after he, realized that he wanted to have a relationship with his kids. He often said too that he's like, I'm getting too old to do this, that he decided that he was going to face, what he was experiencing and what he was feeling, and to do so without using alcohol. And so he's been sober for 21 years now.
Amazing. One teacher asked if it was appropriate to have a Pocahontas doll to teach in a classroom if the teachings are connected to the doll when proper teachings. So she's wondering if it's okay to have a Pocahontas doll in the classroom.
I can't speak on behalf of like all Indigenous like people and say, yes, this is 100% okay or 100% not okay. I think it's important to be mindful that that doll represents a Disney story that is complete, like is very false, that is still accessible. And if that represents that, then I think that there's an opportunity for you to seek out more culturally appropriate and nation specific artwork and dolls. I know that there are lots of folks who will sew mini regalia to put on dolls that they, so I would suggest seeking out whatever nation's territory that you're in, and if there's opportunity to get something a little bit more nation specific and territory specific and culturally appropriate.
For sure. Another question about your dad. Did he have friends at residential school?
He did. He had friends, he had crushes. Unfortunately, it was quite sad a lot of the times. He told me about one time he got punished really badly for sneaking over to the girl side of the cafeteria to talk to a girl he had a crush on. And he was punished quite significantly there. So there were still like social relationships and acts of resistance from the children who were there. But it was still a very, very hard place to be, even if he did have friends.
For sure. Another question was, how many books have you written?
I have written 3 books. I have 2 children's books. I'm Finding My Talk right here, and Swift Fox All Along that you saw in the presentation. And I also have a collection of poetry called I Place You Into the Fire. And that one's skewed for a little bit more of an older audience. I would say high school and up.
Okay. And when did you start writing?
I started writing poetry, I think I was in my mid to late 20s, the first poem that I wrote. So it's not too late to start if you don't think that. I didn't write poetry as a kid. I didn't relate to poetry in school because the poets they taught me were not Indigenous. They were often old, dead white men, and I didn't relate to the content. And so it was once I started reading Indigenous poetry, specifically Rita Joe's poetry, that I started seeing that there was a space for my voice.
Beautiful. I just want you to know that we had classrooms on from Ontario, BC, Yukon, and all over, and so many comments on very well written books. You're beautiful, you're brave.
Thank you.
So a most enjoyable session and very powerful as usual. And if you have any closing comments or any messages, maybe you want to share your social media as well.
Yeah, I'd say closing comments is that they're to try to have these conversations and to know that you probably won't get it right 100% of the time, but you're still consistently engaging in this work. I think that's really important, that it's not a black and white, you're doing it right or you're doing it wrong. I think there's better and more appropriate ways to do things, and there are worse and less effective ways to do things. But the fact that you're trying is really important, and to approach it with a sense of humility, and to reach out and ask questions and take the learning upon yourself. We walk around with phones in our pockets that have access to all the information you could ever find in the world. So, to put in some of that personal work and not necessarily depend on Indigenous people to teach you. I signed up for that role, but not every Indigenous person has. And especially at this point in time, we are getting bombarded with so much messaging and so many stories about what has happened, and it can be really hard on so many Indigenous people this time of year, especially with the conversations that are happening. It can be very triggering for a lot of Indigenous people. So keep that in mind when you're going to ask Indigenous people to help you with your learning, to maybe try first on your own. That would be my closing comments. My social media, it's Becca Leat, BeccaleAt on both Twitter and Instagram. I have a Facebook, but I haven't used it in probably about 3.5, 4 years. So I wouldn't go looking for me there because I'm not.
Well, I'm sure the folks watching today are on Instagram and Twitter and TikTok, so that's great. Yeah, it's been a real pleasure, Rebecca, an honor, and thank you so much for spending time with us today, and best of luck to your dad. I want to thank everyone for coming to this session. We truly hope you enjoy the rest of the week. There's so many knowledge keepers to take in, and again, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Walaliach. Thank you so much.